In February 2017, 6 second-year undergraduate students at the University of Sheffield first met when participating in a week-long research festival, 10 Billion, held by the university, which in part explored the topic of migration. Inspired by Dr Amanda Crawley Jackson, Dr Casey Strine and Dr Sophie Watt, the students took part in a 6-week SURE research project during the summer to further explore the visual representation of migration, its social impact, and its possible influence on migration policy. And here is what they have found.
Media images relating to displaced persons often demonstrate recurring visual representations. 5 common categories portray migrants and refugees as a swarm, the other, criminalized, dehumanized, and as a security risk. We have found that visual representations form the basis of our opinions on the topic. Scholar Terence Wright noted that most images relating to refugees conform to pre-established patterns. The following 3 images exemplify this tendency.
This image, which has been used on many media platforms, shows the common representation of migrants and refugees as a swarm, in that a large group of people are shown in a restricted space, in this case, the boat. We've found that it's more difficult to empathise with a crowd, and scholars have labelled this representation as an undifferentiated mass, which also removes their individuality and thus dehumanises them.
And this image shows the common depiction of displaced persons as criminals. It clearly poses them as different to the viewers in that they are positioned on the opposite side of the fence, and this immediately emphasises them as the other. Fencing and physical blockades are a common feature in the representation of migrants and refugees. It alludes them to criminals and people who need to be isolated from the rest of society, which further amplifies their sense that the displaced persons are the other and different, therefore making it easier for a negative discourse to be formed. As is true for this image, scholars have found that young men heavily dominate media images of displaced persons. However, according to United Nations data, women and children make up a larger percentage of refugees, yet they are largely absent from the dominant media discourse.
Similar to the previous image, here refugees and migrants are framed as criminals and as security risk, despite being largely absent from the image. The presence of the armed police force immediately portrays the displaced persons as a security threat. The fire symbolizes destruction and violence, which further criminalizes the displaced persons who are shown to pose a threat to the wider society.
So, why do the media portray displaced persons in this way?
The usual reasons for fearing the other, I suppose. A fear that it's going to make things worse here, wherever here is. Although I don't know that there's any evidence that would happen. It's a simplistic story. Traditionally, people always are fearful of the unknown, whether it's people from the next village, the next town, the next country, the next religion. So it's not uncommon. It's not a new phenomenon at all.
Why the media does that, I think, depends to some extent on what the context is. But in a lot of cases, and specifically in the cases where we're talking about people who are involuntary migrants, people who are seeking asylum or refugees, it's playing up how different their situation really is, which is interesting because in some cases you might play up the idea that these people aren't so different than we are, and this is something that maybe we should be concerned about happening to us. But for a lot of reasons, I'd have to speculate on them more than I know them. I think the media finds it easier to portray these people as coming from a very different context than we are in, and looking very different than we look, having a very different experience than we have as people.
Scholar Malky highlights the commonly neglected role of visual representations in enforcing the stereotype of the refugee. It has also been found that such visual representations can help to mobilise support, encourage behaviour change, and influence policymakers to shift frames of social issues. So, to what extent are the public aware of this?
It's a vicious cycle because if these people are successfully pictured as a problem to domestic affairs, then politicians can just take the advantage of the image and say, well, if you want me to be in this office, elect me, and then we'll get rid of these people, and then our domestic economy, our domestic welfare, domestic resources can be returned and back to the country. So it's really standard and classic in all over the world, mainly the Western bit, I would say.
Je suis un représentant de la communauté africaine. Nous avions eu effectivement à organiser des séminaires. On a même fait des marches, des démonstrations. Et j'ai eu à rencontrer aussi pas mal d'autorités de ce pays, les MP et les maires et les ministres de ce pays. Pourquoi? Pour parler de ce qui nous concerne, réfugiés, migrants. Je pense qu'il faut community cohesion en organisant des conférences, des débats, des journées portes ouvertes, et puis discuter effectivement de ces problèmes.
Image selection in media outlets plays an essential role in reinforcing the stereotypical narrative of displaced persons. However, they are subjected to many external factors. Former BBC editor Matt Robson talks to us about his experience of this process.
I was a camera person as well as an editor, so you have a kind of shopping list of shots almost in your mind. To tell this story, I need this image. And so when, unfortunately, there are lots of boats full of migrants coming across the Mediterranean. And so if you're sent to cover that story, you will probably come back with the kinds of images you've seen before, and therefore you think that those are the kinds of images that people will want to see. They'll be the ones that your news editor is expecting you to get. They'll be the ones, if you're a freelance, that you'll be able to sell to newspapers. And so I think there is a repetition of images. There becomes a kind of standard image of a refugee or a migrant, and that's what people reproduce.
Images selected by media outlets to represent migrants and refugees all follow similar patterns, as is exemplified by our 5 categories. These images are repeated over and over across many media platforms, reinforcing this particular representation and consequent discourse of the migrant or the refugee. This repetition then formulates an assumption in the viewer of how they expect to see the refugee represented, and this expectation builds up throughout the entire society, from the general public to high-ranking government officials, creating a shared discourse of what a migrant or refugee is. It is often the case that one particular image emerges above the rest, and becomes an icon of the refugee, which in turn shapes the discourse of displaced persons around this single representation. Consequently, a reductionist discourse becomes embedded in society as a social practice, one which becomes so familiar and expected that it remains largely unchallenged or critiqued, and this stereotype is therefore formed. The government then responds to this discourse, which they then use to formulate their own campaigns and their own policies. The media then select images which the government and the public are expecting to see, and then the cycle starts again.
To challenge and critique this dominant discourse, artists, journalists and refugees themselves have started to offer alternative representations to the images selected in the mainstream media.
Contemporary artists approach the subject of displaced persons differently to the mainstream media, in that they require a deeper intellectual engagement with the image, such as the works of the French artist Mathieu Pernaut. Here, the spectator is directly faced with the frontal shot of a covered, faceless migrant. The context of this image is removed completely, and thus requires the spectator to make their own interpretation, and encourages them to carry out their own independent research. Another example is Richard Moss's exhibition The Incoming, held at the Barbican in London last year. He used the same military-grade thermal camera as that designed for long-range surveillance for border control. This created dehumanised, faceless figures, which immediately placed them as the other. His aims were to confront the ways in which the government represent and therefore regard the refugee.
The stereotypical and one-sided representation of displaced persons can also be challenged through the self-representation by migrants and refugees themselves. For example, events such as Migration Matters Festival, which takes place in Sheffield annually as part of Refugee Week. Here, mediums such as dance, theatre and art are used by the displaced persons to give an alternative representation of their lives and culture. Social media is another platform which provides a voice to the inside world in the camps. For example, Nico Swanepoel, a student at the University of Nottingham, has used his Facebook account to display some photographs he took whilst visiting a refugee camp in Lesbos, Greece. These images tell stories which would not typically be focused on in the media. As they are of an uplifting nature, particularly those showing children playing, they provide an alternative discourse to, and therefore, challenge the stereotypical representation of migrants and refugees.
The media have also started to include personalized stories which create positive images of migrants and refugees. On World Refugee Day, the BBC posted a video story on Facebook showing how a refugee in South Sudan becomes a supermodel and uses her influence to help children affected by war. Also, in 2015, The Guardian uploaded a documentary on YouTube detailing thousands of Syrian refugees, including young men, women, and children, sleeping rough at Budapest Keleti stations, waiting for trains to go to Western Europe. Kieran Gilbert, West Africa correspondent for Thomson Reuters Foundation, wrote an online feature about the reasons why Senegalese men choose to migrate, which includes personalized stories from the families. So, how can alternative storytelling narratives change people's stereotypical perception of displaced persons?
But I think basically just telling their full story, and B, showing that the success stories we very rarely see positive stories about, and it can be about anything. It can be about groups, it can be about apps, it can be about, I know there's like a new Airbnb style app that connects migrants with families in the UK that want to take them in. It can be about policies. Just there's so many different aspects where there are success stories and obviously desire to integrate people, but we just don't read about that enough. It's often not sexy enough, or it's going against the narrative the media want to spin, which is that the migrants are a drain and not a potential benefit.
As you can see from the cycle we discussed earlier, repetition of similar images in the media create a single reductionist discourse surrounding migrants and refugees.
One way to break this stereotypical discourse of the migrant and the refugee is to increase public engagement with alternative representations of displaced persons, such as art exhibitions, social media accounts, and personalised media stories.
The exposure to alternative representations opens the door to alternative discourses, and therefore immediately challenges the current dominant discourse spread by the media's repetitive portrayal of displaced persons.
Therefore, individuals would have a better ability to form their own opinion and create alternative and non-stereotypical discourses of migrants and refugees.
Okay. Nous sommes des migrants, of course, mais on n'est pas là seulement pour détruire votre société.